and in some ways it was a Christian nation. But England was a Christian nation too, folks, okay? And we broke away from England. So it wasn't just over Christianity that we broke away, all right? At least they thought they were a Christian. In fact, they had a state church in England. That was one of the little issues that had to do. In fact, many people don't even realize that Virginia had a state church. It wasn't when we talk about separation of church and state, which, by the way, isn't in the Constitution, and it had nothing to do with church having influence over the state as much as it was the state choosing a particular denomination or religion. That's really what the major issue was. It was more protecting the church than it probably was the state. But even when they talked about separation of church and state, Thomas Jefferson, who lived in the state of Virginia, they had a state church. In fact, money came out of the taxation to pay the pastors of the churches in the state of Virginia. So, so it wasn't what we often think about in those particular realms. I want us to look very closely at a particular passage, but before I do, I want to lay the foundation of where Paul's coming from. I want you to recognize he's living as a Roman citizen. He's a Jew, and there's politics all around him. Big-time politics. Remember, the Jews have gone through political changes constantly through their history. Domination by the Greeks, dominations before that by the Persians, before that the Babylonians. And during this time period, Rome is the primary country. Let's go back, went too far. Jeremiah 27, 5 through 6, and keep this in mind at all times. Jeremiah says, "It is I who by my great power," speaking for God, "and my outstretched arm have made the earth, with the men and animals that are on the earth, and I give it to whomever it seems right to me. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him." If you really want to know what your attitude should be toward politics, I suspect the best place to go is go back and look at some of the prophets. What was Daniel's relationship in the context of Nebuchadnezzar? What was Daniel, who's a Jew, whose nation has been destroyed and has been shipped off to live in Babylon, how is his view toward those in authority over him? Or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How do they function within the context of the political structures that they're in? Or go back all the way to David. He's been anointed king over Israel by Samuel, and yet his attitude towards Saul is one of submission at all times. We're going to look at this because I think we need to really think of our mindset, how we think on these political. So in the first place, it starts off is to recognize those who are in power. They're there because God has let them be in power. Does that mean sometimes they're good or bad? Well, they're good or they're bad based on God letting them be there for some reason or another. And God has a function and a purpose in it. One of the problems Jeremiah had in the Old Testament, he was told by God to tell the kings to submit to Babylon. He went and told them, he said, "You submit to Babylon. God has ordained them to come in as a disciplinarian to you because of your behavior, for one thing, but He's put them in control. Do not go to Egypt. Do not go to the surrounding nations and form alliances with them." But you know what they did? They went to Egypt, they went to the surrounding nations and formed alliances. And they did exactly what God told them not to do. They were to submit to Babylon at that time period and not to rebel against Babylon. Now, you may have noticed in the first picture I have a picture of the Statue of Liberty. And we submit to the authorities. But you know, there are political systems all over the world. The U.S. is not the only country. And in fact, if I'm a missionary in the Sudan, I have to think within the context, yes, I'm still an American, but I got dual citizenship. And I have to live by the rules of that particular country, whether it be in the Sudan or some other location, Italy or wherever you might be. You got, and you know what dual citizenship is, by the way. Missionaries aren't dual citizens, but you still have to behave in the context of that nation you're there. A dual citizen is, for instance, if somebody is in this country and they live here and their child is born here, they may have dual citizenship. They get to claim to be American and they get to be able to claim to be somebody else, in another country. You are a dual citizen. You were born in this country, most of you, maybe in another country. You're a citizen of the United States. In a way, you're also a citizen of the world. So you have a responsibility to the whole world. But when you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you become a citizen of another country. It's the kingdom of God. You're walking in this world as strangers. In a sense, yes, you have political responsibilities, you have civil responsibilities where you're at, but your eye is always focused on the hope of another kingdom, another place. And that is the ideal. And the truth of the matter is, this will never be that. It can't be. That is bigger than this. Wisdom of Solomon, this Wisdom of Solomon is not a biblical text. It's what we call one of the apocryphal texts. But it's an intertestamental period, that 500 years between Malachi and the New Testament. But even that, it gives you the mindset of the proper concept or the attitude of the Jews. Listen, therefore, O kings, and understand. Learn, O judges, to the ends of the earth. Give ear, you that rule over multitudes and boast of many nations. For your dominion was given you from the Lord, and your sovereignty from the Most High. He will search out your works and inquire into your plans. I don't know what your political views are to the present President of the United States. I don't know if you're an Obama fan or if you're a Reagan fan. I don't know what you are. But you know what? Regardless of what president is there, God allowed it. God, in some ways, in some ways, we as a people are probably more responsible than from previous generations because we actually get to choose who we want in there. And oftentimes, it's a reflection, who we put in there is a reflection of us. And so if he's there and you want to gripe, then you ought to gripe about yourself to some degree. Because in some way or another, you put him there. And I put him there. We are citizens of two kingdoms. And I have real tensions with this all the time because I get frustrated when I see somebody blasting a president. I don't have to like his policies. I don't have to like what he does and how he acts and all of these things. But you know what? Because I'm a child of God, I have to at least respect him for the position that he is in. How do you think Daniel probably felt toward Nebuchadnezzar? John 18:36-37. Here's Jesus stands before Pontius Pilate. My kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom's not of this world. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king. Notice Jesus never denies being a king. You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. But one thing I want you to see, Jesus pays respect to Pilate. He doesn't blast him. He doesn't say, he says, I have a different kingdom I'm from. My kingdom is of a different type. You want to know the kingdom, the picture of the kingdom? Go read the kingdom parables or a Sermon on the Mount, and you get a good picture, pretty much, of what the kingdom is supposed to be like. Here's our text. I'm going to read through it and then come back, make some statements, because I don't see, a lot of Christians don't pay a whole lot of attention to this text. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Huh? Before I go any further, I just want to stop right here for a moment. Who put Jesus on the cross? We did, yeah, in one sense, because it was a great sacrifice. The Romans. It was the political structures that the Jewish political structure and the Sanhedrin and the religious structures. Well, how would you feel if the person came in here, took me in the political structure, and executed me? Would you be saying, be submissive to the governing authorities? I'm sitting here listening to Paul, and I'm saying, how in the context of what you've gone through, how could Peter make these same kind of statements? Be submissive to governing authorities. It was a government that killed Jesus. And yet they recognize God's hand in the whole thing and says, you remain submissive to the governing authorities. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Jesus didn't resist the authorities when they came to him. He said, why do you come to me as if I'm some big criminal? I've been out in front of you all the time. In fact, he even got he got after Peter for pulling out a sword and cutting off somebody's ear. Now it's interesting, he didn't let Peter have the sword, So he isn't a pacifist in the sense that we aren't to protect our family and our neighborhood and have community responsibilities to one another. I don't think that's true. But Jesus isn't resisting the authorities here. He goes with them. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but bad. We have no fear of the one who is an authority, then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Now we'll look over this in a little bit more detail in just a second. But I want to grasp a second the context. This is 57 A.D. Nero has just become the new emperor following Claudius. Okay, Claudius had kicked Jews out of Rome 7 years earlier, a little earlier than that, and they had started heading back into Rome about 5 years later. All right, so he has no love for Christians, Claudius doesn't. But it hasn't become a big issue yet. Even Nero in the early stages is not a big issue to him at that point. But later Nero would hate Christians. He had them rounded up, dipped in tar, and lit as torches for his parties. He covered Christians in animal skins, threw them to the wild dogs. He ordered Rome set on fire and then blamed the Christians. You've heard about Nero playing his fiddle. Setting off a first wave of official persecution toward Christians. We've largely forgotten how wicked, pagan, ancient Rome really was. Sorcery, black magic abounded, abortion flourished. Homosexuality was accepted as normal. And the masses worshiped Caesar as God, Lord. That doesn't sound like what America is, does it? Maybe it's the direction we're moving. Maybe we're getting there. But we're not there. And yet, what is Paul saying? Paul tells you to submit. Paul tells you in that context, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. You know, I don't like this. There's a book out. I don't know if some of y'all saw it on the internet. This guy he's a Muslim that wrote a book about Christianity, and he says that there's been a lot on YouTube because it was in the Fox Media. There was an interview done, and they said the most embarrassing moment for Fox News or something about this guy. Well, the guy I didn't read the book. I'm not going to buy the book because I'm not going to support the guy because I don't agree with it in concept, because the only thing I heard in the interview that he stated was the word for thief on the cross meant political activist. And that Jesus was a troublemaker and was crucified because he was into politics, something along that line. And this is right in the interview. This is about the only thing he says about it. And that crucifixion was reserved for political lawbreakers. All of that's incorrect. I don't have to read the rest of the book. Number one, that word thief, it means thief. It can mean a bandit who was a political figure, and it does at times mean it, but most of the time in the New Testament it doesn't mean that. And crucifixion was common not just for political execution. It was anyone who wasn't a Roman citizen who committed a crime could be executed by crucifixion. In fact, Josephus even said that masters could take their servants if they hated them and they would crucify them. Even women were sometimes crucified. So the guy's wrong, even in the interview. Why would I want to read his book? But Jesus wasn't a political activist. But what did Jesus focus on? He focused on taking care of showing mercy to the poor. He focused on religious issues and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, who had ruined religion, is what he looked at. Perverting the law. Those are the things he focused on predominantly. Even when they approached him about taxes and Caesar and tried to file him up, giving to Caesar what Caesar's and to God and what is God's. Those that exist have been instituted by God. This is hard for me. It's hard for me to see guys like Saddam Hussein. And I don't have to submit to them because I'm not under their political authority. I don't live there. I live in this country. I'm under this political authority. My foot's here. I'm to be submissive to the authorities. Now we're going to go, there are exceptions to this, and we're going to look at those in a little bit. That's supposed to be underlined. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Why do we have government? I do find our founding fathers were correct in many ways. Why do we have government? We have government because we're sinners. And they have to keep law and order. That's the primary function of government. If people didn't go into houses and rob people's homes, you wouldn't need police officers and you wouldn't need people to protect. If people didn't try to take over other countries, you wouldn't have to have an army. So what is the primary function of government? It's to keep law and order. That's the primary function of government. And what is Paul saying? And in fact, it's one of the earliest institutions in the Bible in Genesis is government. It's instituted very early. Why? Because you got to have law and order. With sinful people. If we weren't sinful people, you wouldn't need to worry about law and order. I wouldn't have to worry about somebody breaking in my car. I wouldn't have to have a lock on my car. I wouldn't have to worry about people slandering or scams and all those things. But because sin came into the world, on a civil level, not everybody's Christian. Not everybody was a Jew. You have to have civil authorities to maintain the structures of the law. And I think that's what Paul is mentioning here. God instituted it, brought it into being to keep the world under some kind of civil order. And he has appointed those. For rulers are not a terror For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Most of the time, rulers aren't. Now, our political founders recognized that government can become evil. That you give people power and they go beyond what they're supposed to do with power. And so they tried to limit government. And that's why we've got, the three branches of government to formulate branches to keep no branch, especially the executive branch, from becoming too powerful. And I think that's because they recognize the sin nature of man and what government would do if government got too powerful. And they instituted a structure that we as people are involved in the political structures. That's odd. Rome didn't have that. It had a Senate. The citizens of Rome were exempt from many of the details of the law that were applied, the harshness toward the slaves and the servants. But they weren't involved in the political process. It was the Senate, a Republican structure. In this country, you're supposed to go to your representatives, and you're supposed to get involved, and you're supposed to be actively, and in order, one thing, so you can make your statement made, and your representative is supposed to represent you within the political structure. But in most cases, we like the law. I like having policemen available to me. Somebody breaks in my house, I get on the phone, call the police. Don't you? Most of the time, if you don't drive too fast over the speed limit, you're not going to get pulled over most of the time. Most of the time, the police don't pull you over unless you're doing something wrong. That's what they're for. So in most cases, government is a good thing. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what's good. In most cases, you don't have to fear the political structures. And you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant. That's interesting. That word servant there is the same basic word for deacon. He's God's deacon. He's God's deacon for your good. He's put there for a function. I look at Paul and I look at Peter and say, it was a Roman government that put Jesus on the cross, and you're saying these type of things? He said, yeah, because this is the function of government. I got too many friends that want to rebel against the political structures of the system and all of this type stuff. Good Christian people, and they would probably totally disagree with me on this. And if you disagree with me on this, it's fine. I'm not going to hold anything against you on it. It's just the way I read the text and the way I have to interpret it. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. What do you do with a sword? I find it interesting to use a sword. This was a common means of execution, the sword. That's how Paul lost his head. See, Paul couldn't be crucified. Why couldn't Paul be crucified? Peter was crucified. He was a Roman citizen. They couldn't crucify Paul because he had certain rights as a Roman citizen. But he could have his head chopped off. Paul, who's saying this, gets his head chopped off by the government. And yet he's saying, submit. He always tried to work within the context of the structures and within the system. He didn't ever rebel against the system. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. We could get into a whole issue on capital punishment or something here. I'm not going to go there. For he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoers. God has actually used other nations to discipline Israel. Anytime that Israel was attacked, it was because Israel was doing wrong. God used the Assyrians, he used the Babylonians, he used the Greeks, he used the Romans, because they were under a covenant with God and they were breaking covenant. So God uses them, and the Jews always understood this. In fact, you find it in their theology, that God used these as instruments of his wrath upon those nations. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. I drive down the road at 80 miles per hour and a 70 mile per hour speed limit. I know I shouldn't be doing that, but I do, you know. I try to push it. I usually go about 5 miles over the speed limit, you know. My son's driving to Florida with my wife. Didn't see the speed limit drop from 70 down to 60, and he's still doing 70, and he gets pulled over. You know, got a ticket. It was actually probably a speed trap. You know, they think it was. But, you know, I do have a conscience. I know I shouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I know when I roll a stop sign, I shouldn't be doing it. For conscience sake, I ought not to do it. There's reasons for those laws. There's for safety purposes. I don't want to see everybody else breaking it, so why should I break it? Then he even goes into, it's actually kind of a quotation from Jesus. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God. This word ministers is different. It's a word that has to do with, is often used for those who work in the temples. It perceives these guys as not just servants or deacons, but as actual ministers of God's grace. What are you doing? You're giving to the government to help pay for civil order, taking care of it, making sure you get those benefits. The fire department and all those type things. It's nice I can get on the phone if I have a fire and I can call them and they send somebody out, or medical services or whatever's available. In most cases, that's what you get. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes, to whom taxes are owed. Revenue, to whom revenue is owed. Respect, to whom respect is owed. Honor, to whom honor is owed. Jesus walks in, talks to Pilate. He doesn't disrespect him. I'm Jesus. I'm the Christ. You need to bow down to me, buddy. No, he doesn't do that. He respects him for who he is. Paul, before, Festus and these guys, he didn't go after them. He showed respect. One of the problems we have is we live in a nation, we live in a world that we don't respect authority. Anytime you say submit to something, you don't want to submit. You don't want to show and appreciate the respect due even for the position that the individuals are in. I'm saying you, I'm saying us, people in general. Women really get upset over the issue of submission to a man in the context of marriage a lot of times. There are exceptions to that, and we're going to go over those. Are there ever any times you should show civil disobedience? Yes, there are. In fact, the apostles did. Peter, however, before I go on, Peter makes basically the same basic statements that Paul does. He just throws out the general concept of submission. Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or the governor as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For it's the will of God. That by doing good, you should put a silence to ignorance and foolish people. I would say those parading around as Christians who are and seem to be in rebellion against the government, they're foolish people. I like Fox News, but some of the people they put on there sometimes, I'm going, what's wrong with you? I get tired of listening to the trash talk. I don't like the policies of our president, a lot of them. But you know what? I don't trash talk our president. I don't trash talk him. I don't say things like, I wish somebody would execute him or something like that. I'm not going to do that. God's got his purpose for him being there. I might not like it or whatever, but he's God. Doesn't mean I can't vote against him. All right? Doesn't mean that I can't belong to a party that has differing views of him or whatever. I can do that. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. See, you're a servant of God too. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Who's that? Christians. but you honor everyone, whether they're Christians or not Christians. Sometimes I hear people, they're not Christians. I hate them. That guy's a Muslim. So, you can't honor and respect him anyway. They lived in a culture where the minority was definitely Christian. Very small minority. Yet they're supposed to respect and honor everybody? Fear God. Honor the emperor. Honor the king. Honor him. Submission implies obedience, but there are exceptions. I want to go over some of these exceptions with you. Exceptions, if you're asked to violate a command of God. If you're asked to kill innocent people, God says, do not kill. And that, by the way, in the Ten Commandments, do not kill. It's talking about taking the life of innocent people. It's not talking about killing somebody who has, committed a crime against the state or capital punishment. It's not talking about that. It's talking about taking the life of the innocent. In fact, here's a command of God. Look what Peter and John say. They answer the authorities. But Peter and John answered them in Acts 4:19 and 20. Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge. For we cannot speak of what we have not seen and heard. They've been given a direct order to shut up about Jesus. We can't do that. Because God has told us to go into all the world and preach the gospel. We're going to do that. I don't care who you are, because we received a direct revelation from God to do this. We've been commanded to Him. We're going to do it. Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. There are times when you know something is wrong that you obey God. You do it. Now, hey, this principle applies to an employer. An employer tells you to do something that you know is wrong, like stealing. You don't do it. You're in submission to your employer for anything within the bounds of what you're supposed to do. But if he's giving you a direct command that conflicts with God's command, see, there's a different pyramid of authorities. God is at the top. You follow God. You follow government. You follow down your employers. You follow whatever, or your employers. Used to be masters, by the way, in a servant civilization. But they can't tell you to do something that is illegal, or they can't tell you to do something which is against the law of God. Then you say no. All right? Just put your foot down and say, no, I won't do it. You might get fired, but you don't do it. If you're asked to commit an immoral or unethical act. There's some Bible examples. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I recommend go and look at these guys. They serve the government of Nebuchadnezzar. You think Daniel wasn't conflicted? I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, the Persians, the Medes, he serves all these different kingdoms and kings. And believe me, there's changes made within each one. And you know what? Where he can, he continues to serve. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are told to bow down to an idol. That went contrary to God saying, you shall not bow down to an idol. They wouldn't do it. They refused to do it. Guess what? They got thrown into a fiery pit. But they wouldn't do it. I would say to you, examples, don't kill the innocent. Don't abortion. It's wrong. It's innocent. It's the innocent. You don't do it. You don't support those who do. And it's all right to stand up against that, even if the government says it's okay. It's innocence. Euthanasia, the abortion. Or not abortion. During the Holocaust, that could happen again. Could be people, the Jews, you're supposed to go kill the Jews or something. Would you hide Jews? Certain moral commands outweigh the command to submit to the government. Corrie ten Boom hid the Jews during the Nazi Germany. You don't take the life of the innocent. And you could go through, there's many, many others, and this is something you have to evaluate and ask yourself, is it a law of God? I will not follow the authority. And the same thing's true in marriage, by the way. Submit to a man doesn't mean total obedience if he's telling you to do things you ought not to do. Go have sex with another man, or tells you to steal, or you say, you can stand up to your husband and say, no, God says I'm not to do that. So yeah, you submit, but there are exceptions in that context with employers, any kind of an authority. If it's immoral, you don't do it. If you're asked to do something against your conscience, do something against your conscience. I like the example from Daniel and his friends eating meat sacrificed to idols. You got to be careful with this one a little bit, okay? Simply because it's against your conscience. Sometimes, well, it's against my conscience to do this. Let me give you an example of one I'd had to deal with. I had an employer one time. I worked for the swimming pool company. It was the only swimming pool company in the city, or in the little town I was in. And he had, he could charge whatever he wanted. But my conscience, he told me to go through and raise the price of everything in the store 20%. Well, my conscience told me that was wrong because he was really taking advantage of being the only store in the community that had these items, and he was taking advantage of his customers. And my conscience was telling me, don't do it. All right? But when I sat down and really evaluated the situation, number one, he owned everything in the store. He's the one that bought it. He could really charge anything he wanted because it was his. And if he wanted to charge those prices, and if some of those items were at Walmart or something, people could check the prices and change it. It would be wrong for me to go against my employer's demands to raise the prices on those. He paid me to take care of the store. Even though it was against my conscience to do it a little bit, it was also against my conscience not to obey my employer. I went through the store and I raised the prices accordingly, according to what he wanted. But you know what? He wasn't really wrong for doing that. I don't know all his situation. It could be that the book that he gave me that showed the retail prices was an outdated book. And he may have been making adjustments for that. I don't know all the details. It didn't hurt anybody. Conscience here with Daniel and friends was actually based on a biblical thing to them. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So he, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego made a pact. They would just eat vegetables. They wouldn't eat any meats. But notice what he did. He still has a submissive attitude. What do? They go to the authorities over and they said, we would like to not have to eat the meat sacrificed to idols. Will you allow us to just eat vegetables? And he has a tizzy up front and is concerned that they're going to look bad if he did that, but he agreed to it for a time. But even in doing what they did, according to conscience, they didn't want to do it. But they still tried to work within the context of the social structures in which they did. Chapter 14, and I'm not going to get to share with you on this, talks about conscience. Paul talks about conscience. If it's in your conscience, you don't want to eat meat, want to be a vegetarian, fine. Be a vegetarian. But don't condemn those who aren't vegetarians. That's your conscience. See, here's the thing about conscience. It's your conscience. Mind your conscience. But don't force your conscience down the throat of other people. Whether I want to eat meat or not want to eat meat, that's my business. If a Christian tells me, I read the Bible, I see there's nothing that says I can't have a drink on Saturday night. And even if I think it's wrong for me to have a drink, I'm not going to tell that brother not to have a drink. There's nothing in the law, nothing forbidden in Scripture. I'm not going to do it. If the Scriptures are very clear that something is wrong, and it's a command of God, then the Scriptures, I obey it. But if it's an issue of opinion or attitude or conscience, we give leeway. And we respect those who have a different attitude in those particular areas. I love that chapter, by the way. Read it. 1 Corinthians has a chapter that parallels it. Paul talks about worship, and he even talks about eating meat sacrificed to idols. He said if a weaker brother, if it's offensive for him to go into the marketplace and buy meats because he might know that they're sacrificed to idols, and he sees you going in and eating those meats, and it offends, and it causes him to do something basically that he would normally go contrary to his conscience, you probably shouldn't do it. But you know you have every right to. Just ignore the fact that it's meat sacrificed to idols. If it's not against your conscience, it's no big deal. You do it. Read the chapter. It'll give you a lot of freedom in Christ, by the way. Here's another one. Daniel refused, based on conscience, to give up the Spirit of God. Not Nebuchadnezzar, but one of the Persian kings that made a stupid mistake of saying you're not to worship anybody but me or bow down to anybody but me. And Daniel got caught in the act of praying to God, which he did several times a day. And what did they do to him? They threw him in a den of lions. Daniel didn't go around preaching to everybody they ought to disobey the king. And everybody ought to do like he is doing. It was an issue of his conscience, and he was not going to go against his conscience, and he continued to pray. But he didn't go around politically telling everybody they had to do like he does. It was something that he did. Here's the issue. But when you resist authority, be willing to accept the consequences. Know that you're going to pay the consequences. Whether you're doing something right or whether you're doing something wrong, you're still going to have to pay the consequences. Paul had his head chopped off. Did Paul do anything wrong? No. But he stood up to the authorities based on his conscience. He went to Rome and he preached the gospel. He did what was right. But he got his head chopped off. Even refusing to obey, do so with a spirit of submission. I love David. Oh, I love David. He was a mess. This guy, I read him, and sometimes I think he was bipolar or manic depressant. He is all over the charts on the emotions when you read the Psalms. He's everywhere, and he's a musician. You guys know musicians. He's a musician. They're emotional folk. But David had a heart for God. He was an incredible leader and charisma, and people attracted to him. And he had a band of guys, and they were followers of him right to the grave, and they would have killed Saul for him, but he wouldn't allow it. And even when he had the opportunity to take the life of Saul, I will not harm God's anointed. I won't touch him. I won't do it. I won't do it. That would be your attitude. You don't do it. I've seen people come into a church. In fact, I was an associate pastor in a church, and the pastor was doing, he had some problems. But I wouldn't rebel against him because he was still God's anointed. Now, if he was doing something totally immoral out of the will of God, and it was something that, obviously stealing or something along that line, then you got to deal with it. But he didn't. He just had some real character flaws in other areas. But I would not try to get people up against him over those issues. I still perceived he was God's servant, and God used him. Should Christians be involved in social issues? Yes. Christians have influenced governments positively throughout history. These changes have also facilitated the spread of the gospel. These changes include outlawing infanticide, child abandonment, and abortion in the Roman Empire. Did you know that? Christians had a powerful impact on that in the Roman Empire. Outlawing the gladiator battles in Rome, outlawing branding the faces of prisoners, instituting humane prison reforms, stopping human sacrifice, outlawing pedophilia. Greece. I read Plato, Socrates, and I love philosophy, especially Socrates. I really enjoy him. But they talk about one of the men coming in with his boy next to him, you know. Pedophilia was rampant. They didn't think anything of it in that society. But it was the Christians that were involved in doing away with those things. Usually it's based on forming a Christian consciousness in the minds of people and working on that Christian consciousness to some degree, or with rational arguments against these type things. Battles in Rome, outlawing branding of faces, etc., outlawing pedophilia, granting property rights and other protections for women. We had that happen in this country. Banning polygamy, prohibiting the burning alive of widows in India. That was due to William Carey's influence in India. Outlawing the crippling practice of binding women's feet in China. Did you know Christians had an influence over that? William Wilberforce spent 40 years in England. Go see the story about Amazing Grace, and fighting against the issue of abortion and transporting slaves. It took him 40 years to accomplish his task. But he kept at it. Why? Because he knew it was wrong. Advancing the idea of compulsory education for all children in Europe, and abolishing slavery. The abolitionary movement was a Christian movement. Now, not all Christians agreed with it. Here's issues we are obligated as citizens of this world to address: protection of life, abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, self-defense, and gun ownership. Those are issues you ought to be involved in anyway and talk about. Marriage, issues about incest, adultery, homosexuality, polygamy, divorce, pornography. The family, including child rearing, education, economics, including taxes, Social Security, health care, the environment, global. I'm not saying you're for or against global warming. I'm saying you ought to tackle these things, evaluate these things, and be involved as Christians in these things, but always in submission to government in the process. You don't do like PETA does and go burn down people's farms or destroy ships or do illegal things in the process. You can look over these. Freedom of religion is important to us. You have to decide these things, but you ought to be involved at some level. At least with representatives. You have those rights in this country to be involved, and you ought to be involved in them. Kingdom attitude. Be somber. The world's kingdom is transitive and temporal. God's kingdom never changes and is eternal. The eternal kingdom should be your model for living in this kingdom. Always keep a foot in God's kingdom. Always know what God's kingdom would be like. How do you do that? Read what Jesus says in the Scriptures. Use Jesus as your model. But you know what? You're not going to conform the world to that. It won't happen. It won't happen. We live in a post-Christian era. What's that mean? We used to say America was Christian. You could work on the Christian consciousness. Mahatma Gandhi, when he was in India, and he stood against the British government. You know why he was able to accomplish what he did? He knew the Christian consciousness of England. And through civil disobedience and doing it with nonviolence, he would accomplish what he did. But he was only able to do that because England still had a Christian conscience. And he knew what that Christian conscience was. Mahatma Gandhi was not a Christian, but he admired Jesus and he believed in the Sermon on the Mount. He thought it was one of the greatest sermons ever preached by anybody. And he used a lot of the principles in England. He stood against India on the issue of the untouchables and was able to do away with almost the entire caste system. Why? Because he was influenced by Christian principles. How do you, as a Christian, reach people who are non-Christian? There are certain Christian principles people still believe in, like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. People believe in that. If you can show people rationally, show them rationally right and wrong, or show the consequences of certain actions that will take place if they continue to society and to themselves, and show it in the life of others, they will respond to that. They don't have to be Christians for that. But you can't say, the Bible says this and you have to do it. That's not going to work in this culture so much because they do not see the Scriptures as authoritative. But it doesn't mean you can't take biblical principles and show if it is truth, God's truth, it's truth. And if it's truth, then it can be demonstrated by means other than just quoting it from God's Word. It can be shown rationally because it's still truth. And you can deal with them on that level. Now, if they have a Christian conscience, if they have a belief in the authority of the Scriptures, then use that. Are you grasping what I'm saying? The eternal kingdom should be your model for living in this kingdom. Proverbs 21:1 says, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills. What should that tell you about political leaders? Pray. Pray. If God's people will turn back to God and pray to God, God can change the minds of the political leaders. He's still in control. Maybe He allows certain things, these things happen because we don't pray otherwise. Jesus answered Pilate, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has a greater sin. We're done. It's okay. I don't need water. I'm okay. Thanks. If that's where he's going. Here's the Lord's Prayer. You pray this all the time, don't you? You should. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We ought to have our eyes focused on His kingdom. The truth of the matter is, all the political activity you do, all that you can do to make changes here, you're doing it for your children down the road, but you're never going to create God's kingdom here. When God is good and ready, He will return His Son to us, and His Son will bring His kingdom. Do we have some of the kingdom here? Yes. You're Christians. You're God's kingdom. You want to see as much of the kingdom of God as you can here? Then lead people to Jesus Christ. Share the gospel. And help train them up in the teachings of the Scriptures. So they'll be more like kingdom people. And make the influence. That's what happened to Rome. That's why so many changes happened in the context of Rome. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth